They told me this story was never meant to reach daylight, not because it was unbelievable, but because it was provable, the kind of truth that doesn't just haunt history. It rewrites it. So before I tell you what happened in Ohio in the winter of 1856, I want you to understand something. There are files, locked, redacted, and quietly destroyed, that confirm everything you're about to hear. Not folklore, not rumor, but fragments of an experiment disguised as faith, buried under the name of mercy. It began with a birth. 3 of them, to be exact. But the way those children came into the world, it wasn't human. Not in the way you and I define it. The people who witnessed it, they tried to call it a miracle. They were wrong. What happened in that Quaker basement was not a miracle. It was a breach. Imagine a night so silent that even the snow seems afraid to fall. Outside, slave catchers moved through the woods like wolves with torches. Inside, a young woman, alone, terrified and bleeding, whispered to her unborn sons in a language no one recognized. And when they came, one after another, they didn't cry. They didn't even breathe until the danger had passed, as if they already knew. That night, a secret was born under the foundation of a church. A secret that would twist through generations, vanish from medical journals, and be whispered about by those who claimed to have seen the boy's eyes. Eyes that watched you as though they were measuring the truth inside your skull. The official records say nothing about them, but the families of Cedar Mills, Ohio, remember. They remember the whispers, the knowing stares, the silence that followed their footsteps. And they remember the way the boys would look at you, 3 pairs of identical eyes, and somehow you'd feel the weight of every lie you'd ever told. You were never supposed to hear about the Triplets of 1856, but someone made a mistake. Someone left a record buried in a farmhouse wall, and once you hear what it says, you'll understand why history chose to forget them. There's something you need to understand before we go any further. The town of Cedar Mills doesn't exist on most 19th century maps. The government claims it was reclassified, absorbed by a neighboring county after the Civil War. That's a lie. It was erased, because Cedar Mills didn't disappear. It was removed, scrubbed from record by men who understood that what happened there could never be allowed to shape the public mind. The Quakers of Cedar Mills believed in equality, but beneath that belief was something darker. Their meeting house was more than a station on the Underground Railroad. It was a laboratory of faith, testing what the human soul could endure when pressed between oppression and revelation. The woman named Ruth, the one who bore the triplets, wasn't just a fugitive. She was the subject of an experiment the world still isn't ready to admit happened. Her arrival wasn't random. The coded journals recovered from the Whitmore family, the Quakers who delivered the infants, suggest Ruth had been sent, smuggled north not only to escape slavery, but to fulfill a design older than the nation itself. You see, some of the Quakers believed that the soul could evolve under the right conditions, that human consciousness could be refined through suffering into something more precise, more awake. They called it the second perception, and Ruth, she embodied it. When the triplets were born, every witness described the same thing. The temperature dropped 10 degrees, the candles dimmed as though the air itself recoiled, and for one impossible instant, every sound, even the wind outside, stopped. Not silence, suspension. Like time itself held its breath. What happened next terrified them into secrecy. The infants didn't cry, didn't flinch. Their eyes were open. All 3 stared upward at the wooden floorboards above, as if watching something unseen move over, ahead. And then, as the hunters passed and the danger faded, all 3 began to cry in unison. The sound wasn't like ordinary crying. Martha Whitmore described it as harmonic, 3 voices forming one perfect note, so pure it made her knees buckle. They thought they had witnessed divine intervention, but what they saw that night wasn't heaven reaching down, it was humanity reaching up, into something it was never meant to touch. At first, the people of Cedar Mills tried to rationalize what they'd seen. It was easier to tell themselves they'd witnessed a strange coincidence than to admit the unthinkable, that 3 newborns had acted with intention. But secrets rot when they're buried too deep, and in Cedar Mills, the rot began with whispers. By the time the triplets reached 6 months old, their presence had already changed the rhythm of the town. The Quakers called them the Quiet Ones. They slept at the same time, woke at the same moment, turned their heads in perfect unison as if responding to some hidden signal. Their laughter, when it came, echoed through the meeting house in 3-part harmony. But what unsettled the adults most wasn't what they did. It was what they knew. When someone lied, even in jest, the boys would all look away, faces blank, eyes distant. When someone spoke truthfully, they smiled. The first time this happened, it seemed innocent. Until Martha Whitmore's husband tried to reassure her that everything was fine, that no one would ever discover the basement beneath the meeting house, the boys turned from him instantly, eyes wide with something like fear. The next morning, the sheriff from a nearby town arrived asking questions about strangers passing through. Someone had talked. After that, the townsfolk began testing them, subtle at first, harmless lies, little deceptions. Every single one was met with the same cold response. No adult could meet their gaze for long. There was a weight behind those eyes, a gravity that pulled hidden thoughts to the surface. Dr. William Harrison, the town's physician, recorded their development with clinical fascination. His surviving letters, the ones not seized by federal archivists decades later, describe what he called the burden of second sight. He wrote, "They do not merely perceive deceit, they feel it, they recoil from it as though it burns their skin. And yet, for all their strange power, they were still children, small, delicate, innocent in their own way. They didn't speak much, but when they did, they often repeated one word, below. No one understood what it meant, not yet, but those who heard them whisper it, sometimes all 3 at once in that melodic rhythm, said it sounded less like a word and more like a warning. It began with a smell, damp earth and iron, the scent that follows freshly turned soil. It seeped through the meeting house floors late one night, weeks after the triplets' first birthday. Martha Whitmore was the first to notice. She thought it was the cellar rotting, maybe a dead animal beneath the boards, but when she opened the trapdoor to check, the scent vanished. The air below was still, clean, silent. That same night, the boys woke screaming, all 3 at once, as though they shared a single nightmare. They clawed at the floorboards, crying the same word again and again, below, below, below. By dawn, the screams had stopped, replaced by a silence so total it made the adults uneasy. When Martha went to check on them, she found the boys sitting upright in their crib, eyes fixed on the trapdoor. Their tiny hands were clasped together, fingers interlaced, praying. Only they'd never been taught to pray. Later that day, Elder Samuel Whitmore gathered a few trusted men to search the basement. They found nothing unusual, no sign of intrusion, no trace of animals. But at the far corner of the dirt floor, one of the men struck something solid with his shovel. He dug it out, a wooden box, small enough to hold in both hands, wrapped in decayed linen. Inside were human bones, infant bones. The men said nothing to the women. The bones were reburied quietly in the woods, but that night the boys began humming, a low, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls. It wasn't music, it was frequency. And when the humming stopped, the scent of earth returned, heavier now, almost suffocating. Days later, the first disappearance occurred. A man named Robert Gaines, a merchant passing through town, vanished after visiting the meeting house to sell supplies. His wagon was found abandoned near the river, his horses still tethered, his goods untouched. When the townsfolk gathered to discuss it, Martha noticed the triplets watching from the corner of the room. Their eyes were wide and unblinking. And as the men argued about what to do, all 3 boys began whispering in that same liquid tongue their mother had used the night she died. One of the townsmen, an older Quaker named Abel Carter, clutched his chest and collapsed where he stood, dead before he hit the floor. The meeting ended in chaos, but the boys never moved. They just stared at the trapdoor, as if something below had finally answered back. Word travels, even when everyone swears it won't. Within months, strangers began arriving in Cedar Mills, men in dark coats who asked too few questions and stayed too long after sunset. They called themselves doctors, ministers, surveyors, but none carried tools of their trade, only notebooks. The first was Dr. Alfred Green of the Ohio State Board of Health, though that board wouldn't officially exist for another 20 years. He claimed to be studying hereditary vision disorders. In truth, he was collecting testimonies about 3 children who could see what no one else could. He met the triplets once, only once. When he left the meeting house, witnesses said his hands trembled so violently he dropped his notes into the mud. He never returned. 2 weeks later, his laboratory in Cincinnati burned to the ground. Cause unknown. After Green came Reverend Calder, dispatched by a regional Quaker council to ensure theological propriety. But Calder's letters, later found in a seminary archive, suggest he had been sent under pressure from a federal office in Washington, newly obsessed with aberrant cognitive phenomena. He wrote, "These boys do not mirror evil. They reflect truth unfiltered, and truth in its raw form is unbearable." The people of Cedar Mills felt it. Livestock refused to drink from the well near the meeting house. Lamps sputtered when the triplets entered a room. Visitors stayed only one night before leaving pale and silent. Still, Samuel Whitmore protected them, convinced their gift was divine. Others disagreed. They said it wasn't holiness, but a contagion, something in the blood that drew attention from powers far beyond the county. By autumn 1858, 2 more inspectors had arrived. They carried metal cases lined with glass vials, claiming to test air quality. At night, they whispered outside the Whitmore farm, measuring distances, mapping foundations. One morning, their tent stood empty, coffee still hot on the coals. The map they'd drawn was gone. In its place lay a single scrap of paper, 3 interlocking circles scrawled in charcoal. From then on, the triplets stopped using the word below. Instead, when strangers approached, they would murmur one word in perfect unison: listen. And those who did said they could hear something faint beneath the earth, not movement, not voices, a pulse. The sound started as a rumor, a thrum that only the youngest or the most frightened claimed to notice. The triplets called it the heartbeat beneath the ground. Adults dismissed it as imagination until the tools began to move. Metal crosses swayed in cemeteries with no wind. Wells rippled though the buckets were still, and every time the pulse grew stronger, the boys would fall silent, heads tilted, as if receiving orders from somewhere too deep to name. Samuel Whitmore kept journals through that winter. Half are missing. What remains tells of visits from representatives of learning. They spoke of magnetic resonance, of suboral communication, terms decades ahead of their time. They offered to relocate the family for study, safe lodgings, steady pay, government protection. Samuel refused. He believed the boy's gift was spiritual, not scientific. But by then, Cedar Mills was no longer his to protect. The federal men returned with instruments, brass coils, tuning forks, mirrored lenses that caught the faintest vibrations in the floorboards. They said they were measuring seismic activity, yet what they measured moved in rhythm with the triplets' breathing. When the boys inhaled, the needles rose. When they exhaled, the pulse subsided. One agent, identified only as Mr. Harper, remarked, "It's as if the earth itself obeys them." The next morning, Harper was gone, his tent shredded from the inside. The remaining officials sealed the basement and forbade anyone from entering. They claimed contamination, but the townsfolk saw wagons at night, hauling crates wrapped in canvas from the meeting house to the train station. No one ever saw what was inside. Within a week, the pulse stopped, for a time. When it returned, it came from miles away, through the fields, through the iron mines, through the very foundations of the town. Some said it was echo, others swore it was Kali, and the boys back to the place where they'd been born. And each time it came, they grew colder. less like children, more like conduits. Their eyes no longer searched faces for lies. They looked through them, like surveyors mapping invisible terrain. Cedar Mills tried to go on as if nothing had changed. But deep down, every man and woman knew the truth. They weren't living in a town anymore. They were living on top of something awake. By 1859, Cedar Mills was no longer a village. It was a diagram. Streets measured, houses catalogued, every conversation noted by strangers who never gave their names. They arrived with forged Quaker letters and government seals, claiming to protect the town from seismic disturbances. In truth, they were building a system of observation. They called it Project Seraphim. No one outside that valley was supposed to know the name. Seraphim's purpose, according to fragments later found in an abandoned courthouse vault, was simple: to learn how belief could be guided, multiplied, or erased. The triplets were the catalyst, but the real study was the reaction, how quickly ordinary people would reshape their memories to survive what frightened them. The federal men didn't need weapons, they used stories. One week the boys were angels, the next they were devils. Each rumor came from a new, anonymous witness. Each lie replaced a truth. Within months, neighbors no longer agreed on what had happened in their own town. Samuel Whitmore wrote that reality itself began to feel negotiated. Merchants swore the church had never existed. Families denied ever sheltering runaways. Maps redrew themselves in county ledgers. It was as if memory obeyed a new law, one written not by God or nature but by men who understood how thought could be tuned like a frequency. The triplets sensed it first. When the agents passed in the street, the boys would cover their ears, eyes wide, whispering, "Too loud, too loud." Yet there was no sound, only the hum of something vast and invisible wrapping around the town. The adults called it paranoia. The journals call it the field. Seraphim wasn't only testing the children, it was testing the town itself. How fear spreads, how certainty collapses, how easily people accept new truths if you give them the comfort of authority. And when Cedar Mills finally vanished, hid from official maps, it wasn't because it had been destroyed, it had been rewritten. If you ever wonder how entire generations forget what once stood in plain sight, remember this: they learned the method here, in a buried Ohio valley, under the name of angels. In the winter that followed, the three brothers began to drift apart. Until then, they had moved as one mind in three bodies, breathing, waking, and sleeping in rhythm. But something shifted after the men of Seraphim tightened their grip on the town. The youngest, Elias, started asking questions. Not with words, he drew. Each dawn, he would scratch circles into the frost on the window pane. They weren't symbols from any language the agents recognized. Yet when you looked too long, they seemed to shimmer, almost move. He said they were places that remember. Dr. Green's successor, a quiet man known only as Barlow, recorded that the boy appeared to interfere with the memory field. Whenever Elias touched one of his drawings, nearby devices faltered, compasses spun, clocks lost time, even human recollection blurred for seconds at a time. What Seraphim had built to erase truth, the child had begun to bend back upon itself. The brothers changed in his wake. The eldest, Nathaniel, grew protective, pulling Elias away from the men in coats. The middle brother, Jonah, watched everything in silence. His journal, found decades later, carried a single line written over and over: "If they can write the world, we can remember it." From then on, faint anomalies rippled through the valley. Files misplaced themselves. Maps reappeared with the original boundaries restored. Residents who had forgotten the meeting house suddenly recalled the smell of its cedar floorboards. It was as if a current of memory had begun to rise against the current of control. Barlow called it cognitive feedback. The Quakers called it grace. But in the nights that followed, when the triplets huddled together whispering through the dark, even grace sounded like a warning, because the field that could erase a town could just as easily erase those who dared to remember it. At first, no one noticed the change. A ledger misplaced here, a forgotten lockbox found in an attic there. But soon the patterns formed, quiet acts of remembering that began to move like an underground current. The schoolteacher started reciting dates the government men insisted had never existed. A carpenter rebuilt the town sign that had been ordered burned, and in every home that still dared to light a candle after curfew, someone whispered a name that history had already deleted: Cedar Mills. The agents of Seraphim called it contamination. They sent new teams with newer instruments, designed not to erase memory, but to stabilize it, fix it into whatever narrative they preferred. Yet the more they pressed, the more the truth slipped through. People began dreaming in perfect synchronization, seeing the same fields, the same meeting house, the same three boys standing in the doorway surrounded by light that wasn't fire. Barlow wrote that the phenomenon behaved like resonance in glass. When one shard remembered its shape, the rest began to vibrate toward it. Elias was the tone that started it, but the entire valley had become the instrument. By midsummer, the line between past and present had thinned to paper. Farmers woke to find their fields ploughed in the patterns of last year's harvest, wells refilled that had long been dry, and sometimes just before dawn the faint pulse returned, not from beneath the earth this time, but from the sky above, answering. Seraphim's reports grew desperate. Subject population exhibiting spontaneous historical reconstruction. Recommend containment. But no containment worked. The people of Cedar Mills were no longer afraid of forgetting. They were afraid of losing what little truth they'd reclaimed. So they began to write, on walls, in hymn books, in the dirt, simple words that refused to vanish no matter how often they were scraped away. By the turn of spring 1860, the men who had built Project Seraphim could no longer tell whether they were studying the town or the town was studying them. Reports contradicted one another. Dates shifted in their own ledgers. One field officer swore he'd been stationed there for 6 months. His pay records showed 2 years. Another claimed to have destroyed the meeting house, yet every dawn it reappeared on the ridge, untouched, its cedar roof glinting like a mirror in the mist. They began to doubt their own memories. That was the first sign the experiment had turned inward. Elias's sketches spread through their documents like mold. Someone had copied them without realizing it. Tiny, interlocking circles penciled in the margins of charts and rosters. When viewed together, the drawings formed a pattern so precise it resembled circuitry. The engineers called it feedback interference. Barlow called it conscience. The agents started dreaming of the same phrase written in black ink on white paper. If they can write the world, we can remember it. No one could trace the source. The handwriting matched no one's on file, and yet every officer knew the words by heart when they woke. Seraphim issued an internal order to suspend all field operations. Too late. The signal had already looped back through their instruments, carried on the same frequency they had used to edit thought. Whatever force had once kept the people of Cedar Mills obedient was now rewriting the keepers themselves. Within weeks, the chain of command fractured. Files vanished from the capital. Rail shipments marked for archival containment never arrived. The project still existed on paper, but no one could locate its offices. It had dissolved into rumor, an idea trying to hide from its own reflection. And somewhere beneath that quiet valley, the pulse began again, not as warning this time, but as invitation. They returned to Cedar Mills in the dead hush of winter, guided by coordinates that didn't exist on any modern map. The road that led there had long since dissolved into earth and memory, yet the car's headlights followed a path as if the land itself remembered where to go. Snow fell in slow spirals, not drifting from above, but rising from the ground, as if gravity had reversed for this one forsaken corner of Ohio. When they reached what should have been the town, there was nothing. No lights, no buildings, not even foundations. Only the outline of structures pressed into the frozen soil, like the ghosts of walls. The lead agent, a man too proud to ever admit fear, said, "We've come too far to find nothing." But even as the words left his mouth, the wind carried back a whisper that mimicked him perfectly, syllable for syllable, as if the town itself had spoken. They found the meeting house by accident, not standing but imprinted. a shape beneath the snow where the ground was strangely warm. When they brushed it aside, they uncovered brickwork untouched by time. It was still there, the same brick that the Quakers had laid by hand a century before, unweathered, unfrozen, alive. The youngest agent reached out and placed his palm on it. His breath caught. He whispered, "It's vibrating." The others leaned close and felt it too. A pulse, faint but steady, as though the foundation itself had a heartbeat. Then came the sound, not from below, but inside their skulls. A soft, rhythmic hum, 3 tones repeating, too measured to be random. Ezra, Caleb, Isaac, the triplets. Their names weren't spoken but known, felt. The hum aligned with their heartbeats, and one by one, the agents felt theirs begin to slow and match the rhythm of the vibration. One of them tried to step back, but his legs refused. His body swayed in perfect synchronization with that buried pulse. And, in that moment, they realized what had always been hidden. The triplets had never died. They had simply gone deeper. The snow fell harder now, swirling in strange geometric patterns. The sky flickered once, like a film reel stuttering. And then they heard the whisper again, from beneath the frozen ground. "We've been waiting for you." When they uncovered the trapdoor, it didn't creak. It sighed, like something exhaling after holding its breath for 170 years. The oldest agent swept his flashlight across the opening, revealing a staircase carved into packed earth. Each step was blackened, not with soot, but with something that shimmered faintly under the light, residue that looked metallic, but pulsed like skin. They descended. The air grew warmer with every step, the cold winter above dissolving into a damp, living heat, and with it came the sound again, 3 notes, perfectly timed. Thrum, pause. Thrum, thrum. It wasn't coming from below. It was inside their skulls again, vibrating against bone. The youngest agent pressed his palms to his ears and muttered, "It's in me. It's in me." At the bottom, the light caught something impossible. The basement was intact, untouched by decay. Wooden beams still sturdy, straw still scattered where Ruth had lain. And on the far wall, carved into the brick, were 3 symbols, identical spirals, each intersecting at a single central point. But that wasn't what froze them. What froze them was that the symbols were fresh, carved into wet mortar. The lead agent knelt down, brushing his fingers over the grooves. The surface was warm. He whispered, "Someone's been here." The reply came instantly, in the same voice. "Someone's still here." The lights flickered and failed. Darkness swallowed them whole, and in that void, shapes began to emerge. Faint, luminous outlines of children. 3 figures standing perfectly still, their eyes like mirrors reflecting nothing. They didn't move, but the agents felt their presence pressing into the space, into their lungs, their thoughts, their memories. The triplets' voices didn't come from mouths. They resonated from the air itself. "You followed the hum," they said as one. "You came to measure what can not be measured. Now you must listen as we did." Then, one by one, the agents dropped their flashlights, their hands trembling as visions began to pour into their minds. The underground railroad tunnels, Ruth's final breath, the moment the Garrett brothers stood above their hiding place. And something else. A chamber even deeper. A second door beneath the basement. The one Samuel Whitmore was ordered never to open. And as the triplets' glow began to fade, one word echoed through all their minds, a word older than English, older than faith itself. Return. The second door wasn't built by hands that knew mercy. It was smaller than they expected, round, seamless, and pressed into the earth like a sealed wound. Its surface was made of the same metallic residue they'd seen on the stairs, but when the lead agent touched it, the vibration matched his pulse perfectly, then replaced it. For a moment, his heart stopped beating on its own. The rhythm came from the door now. He whispered, "It's alive." No one contradicted him. The youngest agent scanned the surface with his tablet. It glitched instantly. The screen filled with repeating coordinates that shifted faster than the human eye could follow. Latitude, longitude, dates, all in the year 1856. Every line ending in one phrase. They never left. When they tried to pry the door open, it didn't resist. It yielded. The metal rippled beneath their hands like water, sinking inward and revealing a narrow passage spiraling down. Warm air surged upward, carrying with it the faint scent of iron and rain-soaked earth. They descended, one by one. The deeper they went, the more their sense of time fractured. Watches stopped. Clocks on the instruments blinked out, then reappeared at random intervals. When they finally reached the bottom, what awaited them wasn't a chamber at all. It was a circular room with no visible walls, just a horizon of darkness interrupted by flickering distant lights. Stars. No. Eyes. And in the center, a single chair. The lead agent stepped forward, drawn without understanding why. On the chair sat a leather-bound book impossibly preserved. Its cover bore the same spiral symbol carved into the meeting house wall. He opened it. Inside, no words, only impressions pressed into the pages, as if written by touch alone. 3 sets of handprints. Small. Perfect. Then, as his fingers brushed the impressions, his vision shattered into fragments. Scenes of the triplets grown, their faces blank, moving through towns at night, whispering to leaders, doctors, clergy, teaching them how to see lies and how to weaponize truth. The institutions built from their teachings were not moral systems, they were control systems. The hum returned, louder now, flooding the chamber, pulsing with command. The agents fell to their knees, clutching their heads as the word carved through their thoughts again and again. Return, return, return. When the sound stopped, they were alone. The chair was empty, and the book gone. They climbed for what felt like minutes, but when they emerged, the world above was unrecognizable. The meeting house was gone, not destroyed, gone. In its place was an open field, slick with rain that hadn't been falling when they went below. The air smelled electric, like the atmosphere before a storm. The lead agent looked up at the horizon and froze. The sun was rising in the west. No one spoke. Their instruments blinked nonsense. Dates reading April 12, 1907, then June 3, 1939, then blank. One by one their devices died, until the only light left came from the sky, pale and trembling. They tried to call for extraction, but the radio emitted only one sound, the same 3-toned hum that had followed them since the basement. Thrum. Pause. Thrum, thrum. The youngest agent fell to his knees, whispering the names. Caleb, Ezra, Isaac. The sound responded. Louder, closer. The field itself began to tremble. Something was beneath them again. They turned to run, but found they were surrounded by structures that hadn't been there seconds before. Silent buildings, red brick, Quaker style. The entire town of Cedar Mills had reassembled around them, restored to perfect condition, but utterly lifeless. Doors hung open. Windows glowed faintly, though no one moved inside. And from somewhere distant, a child's voice called out. Gentle, familiar, and impossibly near. You wanted the truth. You brought it with you. The lead agent looked down at his hands. His palms were covered in dirt and ink. Ink that pulsed faintly like blood. He rubbed at it, but it wouldn't smear. The spiral symbol was burned into his skin. One of the agents began to laugh, a dry, breaking sound that quickly turned to screaming. He pointed to the town center, where 3 figures stood motionless, watching. The same children they'd seen below, older now, or maybe just clearer, the triplets, or what they had become. Their eyes reflected nothing. No sky, no light, no soul. Only the viewer's face, twisted and confused. And then all three spoke in unison, the sound reverberating through every building in Cedar Mills. "You never left the basement." The town breathed. That was the first thing he noticed. Every wall, every doorway, every window frame, expanding and contracting almost imperceptibly, as though Cedar Mills itself were drawing breath. The air shimmered with heat, though the rain hadn't stopped. The lead agent stumbled down the street calling the others' names, but his voice came back delayed, a half-second late and not quite matching his tone. Echoes that didn't belong to him. At the far end of the square stood a statue that hadn't been there before. Three boys, hand in hand, carved from a material that wasn't quite stone. Their faces were blurred, unfinished, but their eyes had been polished until they gleamed like mirrors. On the base of the statue, the same spiral symbol burned faintly, surrounded by a ring of text he couldn't read, letters that rearranged themselves whenever he tried to focus. He felt a pressure building behind his eyes, and then the memories began to fracture. He saw flashes of a laboratory, not the 1850s, but modern, government seals, a corridor filled with humming equipment. He saw the book again, not in his hands, but in a glass case, wired and monitored. Scientists arguing over its pulse. The project name etched on a file, the Return Initiative. He remembered signing a document, volunteering for something that was never explained. He remembered the voice of a woman saying, "We're going to finish what Samuel Whitmore started." His breath caught. Whitmore, the Quaker elder, the man who built the meeting house and the second door, but Whitmore wasn't an ordinary abolitionist, was he? No, the journal entries had been redacted, pages replaced. The truth had been hidden beneath the language of faith. The tunnels weren't just routes for the fleeing. They were conduits, structures built on geometric precision, aligned to something ancient that predated every church and Tate. The lead agent looked up again. The triplets were closer now, standing at the edge of the square, eyes reflecting him from every angle. One of them, Caleb maybe, spoke. "You built the door again?" He wanted to deny it, but the mark on his palm pulsed, proving otherwise. The second triplet stepped forward, voice like the echo of his own thoughts. "You brought the pattern back into the world. Now it will finish what it began." And somewhere beneath the earth the hum rose again, slow, patient, hungry. By the time he reached the edge of town, every compass had stopped pointing north. Needles spun in slow, lazy circles, tracing the spiral that now pulsed faintly under the asphalt. Even the rain fell differently, diagonal, rhythmic, following the beat of the hum that had moved from the earth into the air, then into the very current of thought. The surviving agent, his name barely his own anymore, found refuge inside what looked like an abandoned communications substation. Its walls were lined with silent monitors and forgotten equipment, dust layered thick enough to muffle sound. He slammed the door shut, panting, half expecting the hum to stay outside. It didn't. The screens flickered on, one after another, without power. Every display showed the same image, a spiral made of faces, thousands of them, each rotating slowly, merging and splitting, repeating the same 3 syllables in a sound too soft to be language. He yanked cables out, shattered a monitor, but the glow simply crawled across the floor like spilled mercury, reassembling on the far wall. The pattern wasn't digital, it had learned the geometry of attention itself. Anything that could reflect, a lens, a thought, a memory, became a conduit. That's when he understood what return really meant. Not resurrection, not reunion, replication. Every time someone looked at the spiral, they copied it inward. Every retelling, every photograph, every whisper drew another loop, another iteration. He could feel it tightening behind his eyes, mapping itself into the folds of his brain like a parasite that fed on comprehension. He opened his field journal, last page blank, and began to write his final directive. Do not describe the pattern. Do not draw it. Do not even think of it as shape. It is not an image, it is an invitation. His handwriting faltered. The hum grew faster, syncing with his pulse again. He felt his own thoughts turning in rhythm, words repeating, shapes forming behind his eyelids. He looked up at the dead camera in the corner and whispered, "If anyone finds this, delete it. Delete me." But the camera's light blinked red. The transmission had already started. Somewhere far away, on another screen, the spiral began to form again. The first thing you notice about the recording is the sound. Not the hum, at least not yet, but the static underneath it. The kind that isn't quite electrical, more like wind moving through a hollow place. The image flickers. A man's face, half lit by a single bulb, eyes wide and glassy, as if he's been awake for days. "If this plays, it means the quarantine failed," he says. "But you're not infected. Not unless you start to remember." The screen jumps. The walls behind him are covered in symbols, but not the spiral, just numbers, coordinates, fragments of a map. He traces them with trembling fingers, as though the act of explaining might hold him together. We thought the pattern was geometry. It's not. It's memory pretending to be shape. The more we tried to erase it, the more it rewrote us. Every deletion became an outline. He stops, looks directly into the camera. For a moment, the feed fractures, the pixels bending outward like liquid glass. When the picture steadies again, he's closer. You can see the mark on his palm, faded now, but still pulsing faintly under the skin. If you're seeing this, it means it's looking back. But that's all right. It only needs to be seen to end. Don't draw it. Don't describe it. Just remember that it was a story. Only that. The frame freezes. Then the recording cuts to a static-filled room. Empty chair, half-open notebook. On the final page, written in quick, sharp handwriting, every pattern begins as a story. Every story ends when someone stops telling it. The tape clicks. The screen goes black. And somewhere in the silence between frames, the hum finally stops. Years later, the investigation files on Cedar Mills were quietly reclassified as unresolved infrastructure collapse. No one mentioned the recordings or the missing agents. The case dissolved into bureaucracy, one more folder buried under the weight of unending paperwork. Still, a few fragments remained. A broken camera, a field notebook half filled with indecipherable coordinates, and a photograph of a town square that no longer exists. The edges of the print have faded to white, except for one faint impression in the dust, a spiral that isn't quite there when you look at it straight on. Historians eventually folded the legend into folklore. They said the Quaker tunnels beneath Cedar Mills were part of the Underground Railroad. They said the hum was just the sound of shifting groundwater under abandoned mines. They said the triplets were never real at all, only metaphors for conscience, reason, and faith. Yet, every few years, someone finds the story again. A late-night researcher scrolling through lost archives, a filmmaker looking for inspiration, a reader curious enough to follow the trail back to a name, Whitmore, Samuel, and a symbol carved into an old meeting-house beam. The pattern, it seems, survived in the safest way a story can, not as proof, but as a rumor, not as geometry, but as memory. And when people whisper about it now, they do so like any other ghost tale, quietly, around fires, or in libraries after closing time, never sure where it began, always certain it's already ended.